with the amount of people we have in the room. I think people will keep going in, but I'll start with the introduction. My name is Mustafi Sharif, and I am the London Regional Manager at MEND, and I will be your host for today. We've got a lot to get through today. There's a whole load of discussion to be had. I'll just start with a quick introduction. So, what has happened is the government inquiry into Islamophobia and a call for submissions has prompted a lot of discussions, both within our community and outside of it, around definitions, terms, how we use them, how useful they are for us, how well they represent us, how we feel about them, and so on. And you all might think Islamophobia is something us as Muslims we experience every day. We know what it feels like, we know what it looks like, we know how it manifests in our own lives. Um, but you might have noticed that the panel to speak about it today, or here to speak to you about it today, is mostly a panel of academics. And the reason for that is, although the experience of Islamophobia is something every single one of us can describe in our day-to-day lives, definitions and terminology is important because it's how that can then be used to protect us, how that can be used to organize and to legislate. That matters. And so, with us today to talk us through this and to walk us through this discussion is Dr. Shaheen. I'm going to leave it up to the speakers to introduce themselves however they choose to. So, we have Dr. Shaheen. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Shaheen. Would you like to just give it like a brief introduction of yourself and what you'd like to speak about today?
Yeah, Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Hi.
And,
Okay.
thank you for having me on this panel as well. Yeah, so my name is Shaheen, and I am part of the National Council of the MCB, and I'm also a lecturer in social policy and sociology at the University of Leeds. And I guess I have 5 minutes for a brief.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah. So as we all know, the government has formed a new working group to define Islamophobia. But this is not a genuine attempt to tackle Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. A clear community-backed definition already exists. The APPG definition of Islamophobia, developed through extensive consultation with academics, activists, and grassroots Muslim organizations, already exist. Yet the government is now sidelining that consensus in favor of the term or alternate terms like anti-Muslim hate or anti-Muslim hatred. At the same time, also ignoring key Muslim organizations like the Muslim Council of Britain and MEND, for example. They refuse to engage with these organizations. So this is not about a clearer language. It's a political move to dilute the power of a term, a concept that names structural injustice. It's more about who gets to define reality and who gets to be heard. And we have to keep in mind that Islamophobia as a term is not new. The term has a very long history. It was used by British Muslims in the early 1990s and appeared as early as 1904 in some cities in Cairo, and even earlier in one form or the other in colonial British India. And all throughout its usage, it's always described political hostility, not about personal prejudice. Second, the move to replace Islamophobia with alternative terms like anti-Muslim hate is not actually neutral, it's more harmful. Anti-Muslim hate or anti-Muslim prejudice reduces the problem to individual acts of abuse or violence, which also is a problem, but it does not address the structural aspects of Islamophobia. The structural aspects is found in policies like prevent, discriminatory policing, biased media reports, and in the systemic obstacles Muslims often face in employment, in education, etc. So literally, it is embedded in the system. Third, Islamophobia targets not just belief, but racialized perceptions as well. People assume to be Muslim because of their name, skin color, or clothing. You don't need to be a practicing Muslim to be targeted. So this is how racism functions through religion, and hate or prejudice doesn't capture that aspect. Fourth, Islamophobia is not always exclusionary. Sometimes it's about conditional inclusion. Muslims are only accepted if they conform to a dominant narrative, to dominant norms, renounce their politics, or prove their loyalty. And that is not hate or prejudice, but it is structural, again, Islamophobia. And fifth, erasing the term Islamophobia or disusing it disconnects us or Islamophobia from the global systems, colonialism, the war on terror, foreign policy. You can't understand Islamophobia without seeing these global links, from drone warfare to border control to media narratives as well. So these are some aspects that would go missing if we follow the government norms. So when we insist that it's not about free speech, it's about power, and we must insist that Islamophobia is real, it is racialized, it is structural, and it must be named as such. Defining Islamophobia or understanding Islamophobia as racism doesn't limit freedom, rather, it enables justice. Yeah, I hope that's enough for a 5-minute brief.
And that's perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen. And we also have Dr. Sabira, our own Dr. Sabira from MEND. Would you please introduce yourself and just a brief introduction to what we're going to speak about before we go into the questions?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name is Sabira Bayat, Senior Policy Analyst at MEND. And of course, as you might know, our organization, our aim is to tackle Islamophobia. So it's something that, we've been working on. We've got that experience with the community, on the ground kind of experience of what Islamophobia actually is and what it looks like. So we've long advocated for an official definition of Islamophobia. And we've worked with local councils and authorities to adopt the APPG definition of Islamophobia. Yeah, I mean, like as Salsabil mentioned, this is about the government's call for evidence on the Islamophobia hatred definition working group. And as part of that, we have called on the government to adopt the APPG definition and suggest the term Islamophobia is used over terms like anti-Muslim hatred, as Shaheen said, which is not as useful in capturing the the broader forms of discrimination that Muslims face, on the structural and institutional level. Other things we highlight how, contrary to critique, such a term and definition does not infringe on freedom of speech, but rather provides a more comprehensive definition to capture the broader forms of discrimination beyond simple hate crimes that anti-Muslim hatred, terms like anti-Muslim hatred might a narrowed term like anti-Muslim hatred might capture. So and again, things like the racialization of Muslims should also be included in any definition of Islamophobia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Amina Shuri said she was just going to go and pray. I'm not sure if she was able to come back. Dr. Amina, if you're here, raise your hand or say something. Because if she's not back, we'll go on to the first question and then we'll ask it to her when she's back. Okay, so the first question is around the key contested topic, which is specifically the name, right? So you've got two names, you've got Islamophobia and you've got anti-Muslim hatred. Now, one of the reasons people say things like we shouldn't adopt the term Islamophobia, we shouldn't accept the term Islamophobia is how it ends, the whole phobia thing, and the idea that calling it a phobia kind of legitimizes the notion that being a Muslim or being around Muslims is something to actually fear. However, people say that the anti-Semitism definition, for example, has been a successful one at deterring people, and not that anti-Semitism isn't actually a problem within society, and so anti-Muslim hatred is a better term to use because it sounds more similar. Starting back with you, Dr. Shaheen, why would you insist on the term Islamophobia specifically, despite the fact that it may not be perfect?
Thank you. One of the criticisms that's often cited against usage of Islamophobia is the argument that it is not a phobia. Now, people sometimes confuse the meanings of words, or they try to understand the meaning of words by its constituent parts. So people assume that there's phobia and Islam, so that's how the meaning comes. Now, unfortunately, that is not how words derive their meaning from. For example, a similar term, xenophobia, and xeno is stranger. And xenophobia doesn't actually mean, no one actually defines it as fear of a stranger. It's more understood as hostility towards people of not your ethnicity or of your presumed race. And it is not just technical terms, even common words we use every day. For example, a butterfly is not a butter that flies, or a fly that likes butter, for example. So we have all these terms in everyday usage, which we always use. But when it comes to Islamophobia, we come with this argument. is rather as a concept, and not just as a word. Even historically, if you look at the genealogy of Islamophobia, you would find words like Islamophobia being used in the 1880s in colonial India. You'd find words like Turcophobia used. You'd find even in the history of anti-Black racism in the US, you would find phobia being used in the 30s. In none of this usage, phobia was actually used as pathology or medical or biological. It was used as political hostility. So one, you have a history in various terminologies, concepts where phobia has been used as hostility, basically political hostility. And then you have Islamophobia where it should be seen as that way. But only in this specific argument, it comes towards this idea that it is phobia, it is fear, so it's not a perfect word. So it denies genealogical history of it, and second, denies common sense as well. And in terms of why that we prefer Islamophobia instead of anti-Muslim hatred, I think I just alluded to it in the beginning as well when I just spoke for 5 minutes, that Islamophobia is not about isolated acts of hate. Now, when you say hatred, it always, or even prejudice, it becomes a matter of individual hostility. Someone yelling abuse on the street, a physical attack, a discriminatory joke. And of course, these things are real and harmful, but they are just the tip of the iceberg. Now, when I said it is a structure and it is embedded in immigration policies, in media narratives, in counter-extremism frameworks like PREVENT, and it is the reason why Muslims, for example, disproportionately stopped and searched, they're surveillanced, they're silenced. It shapes suspicion on Muslim charities, difficulties charities face today. It shapes the way Muslims are portrayed in fiction and news, and also the barriers Muslims face in employment, social mobility. So in short, Islamophobia is systemic, and hatred or prejudice does not cover that aspect of it. And finally, there is also the claim that dropping the Islamophobia removes, as I said earlier, the issue from its global historical context. And most importantly, the term Islamophobia, it comes from below. It came from the community. It was described as to portray real lived experiences and to demand recognition. Replacing it with a more sanitized, individualized, institutional term like anti-Muslim hate or prejudice erases that history. It shifts power away from the communities and gives it back to institutions that too often marginalize us as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Severo, you're someone who works with MEND and has written a lot on Islamophobia, produced a lot, spoken a lot about policy, and MEND has been organizing around it. Don't you think that call for a change in that term is a loss, in a sense, of that history and of that work that has been put in? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry, could you repeat that question? Sorry.
So the question is around work. So there's
She
been a
can't
lot
speak
of
English
organizations,
properly.
MEND as an organization itself
Yeah.
has put in a lot of work into making the term Islamophobia mean something. So semantics aside, there's been some effort put in. You're someone who's written about it as well extensively over a period of years. And so don't you think that the idea of changing it for a term, even if it is linguistically better, it would still demonstrate a huge loss?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like as Shaheen put it, quite well, that we have that history, with the term Islamophobia. It's something that is widely recognized. It's something that I think on an international scale as well. If you look at the term, discrimination against Muslim, the term Islamophobia is something that is, even has been adopted by the UN, United Nations, the International Day to Combat Islamophobia on the 15th of March. The term of Islamophobia is used, and they have their own working definition of Islamophobia. So definitely there is that kind of, the fact that it has already been used so widely and it's already been recognized so widely, to kind of push that to one side and bring in something that only covers a small aspect of the forms of discrimination that Muslims face, I think it would be a huge loss, because I mean, like, it wouldn't effectively address the broader forms of discrimination that Muslims face. So for example, visible acts of hostility like verbal abuse and physical attacks, as alongside more subtle and systemic forms of discrimination that we find in policy, in media portrayals, workplaces or education. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at anti-Muslim hatred, it is quite a narrow term and focuses mainly on acts of hate and violence, and it kind of misses that broader picture. So yeah, definitely it would be a huge loss if we were to focus, if we were to lose the term Islamophobia over anti-Muslim hatred, especially where it provides a more comprehensive and actionable understanding, not just about discriminations that Muslims face, but those perceived to be Muslims as well. To understand that it goes beyond just what we experience, but can also experience those perceived. So it's an attack on Muslim identity as well. More visible forms of Muslim identity beyond just attacking someone for their beliefs. So yeah, Islamophobia, I think, captures that more broader forms of discrimination better than I think anti-Muslim hatred.
Thank you very much. Dr. Amina Sharif, Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Salam, I can't, I'm not sure if your mic's working.
One more time. How about now?
Yes, we've
Okay,
got
perfect. And do you see my video as well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Great.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
So we actually had just started briefly the discussion because we covered, the background to this and the government inquiry, and we had moved on to the idea. So the terms, the whole debate around terms, which one's better to use? Does it actually matter if we can pass a definition that works for us? And also just semantics, terminology, and insight into why. Why is there such a huge debate around it currently? Just give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the others for your contribution. I don't want to repeat anything that was already said. I think Sabir and Shaheen really nailed the sort of question of the definition on the head. I guess I would just add that Islamophobia means nothing on its own. It's a term, it's a word, and you need to pour meaning into it. And the meaning that you pour into it, therefore, expands or limits its explanatory power. And so if you take a perspective that, for example, centers the psychological, which would be a perspective that draws on language such as bias, prejudice, hatred, phobia, then you would have the effect of narrowing Islamophobia to a problem of, a failed psyche, the psyches of individuals who are, on the margins of society. They're socially aberrant. They are people that we would want to disassociate ourselves with. Islamophobia is not a problem of the polite classes of society. So that would be sort of what would happen if you were to use this language of psychology. You individualize Islamophobia, you take attention away from the structural aspects, which Shaheen and Sabira nicely referenced. Now, if we take a structural perspective, there are many perspectives that we could take from that perspective as well, right? So you have a perspective of Islamophobia as a form of racism, but what does racism mean? Racism itself doesn't mean anything until you define it, right? And so you have so many different perspectives on racism that can actually limit and narrow what you're talking about. So I'll give you a really quick example. Liberal perspectives on racism, I would say, are some of the most narrow perspectives, right? When it comes to what racism is. Why? Because they begin with the assumption that society is foundationally just, right? We live in a society that offers equal opportunities to everybody, and racism is merely discrimination from an equally just society. Racism is an aberrant feature of a foundationally just society. Now, this is a fundamentally different assumption from one made by critical race theory, for example. And I mentioned this previously on a call that we were on. Critical race theory starts from the perspective that society is founded on racial hierarchies. And so therefore, if you take a perspective to racism that makes that assumption, then you are going to expand the explanatory power of Islamophobia if you define Islamophobia from that perspective. So yes, it's important to define Islamophobia as a form of racism, but let's try to move away from liberal conceptions of racism, because what they will do is simply say that Islamophobia is, it's dermatological, it's on the surface, it's not embedded in the very sort of DNA of a society. So now, okay, so if we're going to take a critical race theory perspective, sorry, I've got an audience here. That's what happens when we have evening calls, but okay, awesome. So you can, okay. That was him asking permission to watch something he wasn't supposed to watch, which is the price I have to pay to be on this call in the evening. Anyway, so what was I saying? Something about racism, right? So if we take a critical race theory perspective, we can then begin to talk about racism as this racialized social system, right? It's a system that then sort of encodes racial advantage to some, and it creates racial subordination for others. And then we can also begin to sort of define Islamophobia as a system of managing a population, right? Particularly a racialized population. And that becomes interesting here, because we can look at counter-extremism policy that Shaheen mentioned. We can mention, or we can look at educational achievement of Muslims. We can look at employment outcomes, and we can say, oh, look, the way Muslims are quote unquote disadvantaged, because this is kind of liberal language here, but the way the Muslims are not within that system of receiving access to these social goods and resources is a way of managing a population, maintaining their subordination. And there's one final perspective that I particularly like. Of course, there's many others, but one that I like, that I'm leaning towards at the moment, and you might have come across it in some of the work that is in the public domain that I've put out, to my detriment, perhaps. As some of you know, I got attacked for the little video explainer that we put out, and anyway, that's sort of comes with the territory, doesn't it? Anyway, what was I saying? Right, the final perspective, or a perspective that I'm leading toward, is one that looks at Islamophobia, or racism, sorry, as the management of populations through death itself. And now this becomes really interesting, because when we talk about exclusion from housing, from employment, from education, from health and healthcare, we're not stopping there by saying Muslims are excluded from it. We're taking it further to say, what happens when communities are excluded in this way? Well, what happens is slow death, right? It's the inability of a population to flourish. And when we look at state violence, we can begin to see then that actually, no, we're managing populations through either slow death or immediate death, right? And yeah, so this is where I am in my thinking on Islamophobia. And yeah, look out for some work of mine that I'm putting out, inshallah, soon.
Amazing, thank you. I think just a final summary or a takeaway from the session on specifically on the terminology. A term only means as much meaning as you give it. It's up to people who are working to define the term, and people who are working on it, who are building to define what it means. Islamophobia can mean whatever we make it mean, and that's the the realm of building power and influence, knowledge, education, and so on. Okay, brilliant. Now on to the definition part of things, because actually I was speaking with someone yesterday at a very interesting event, and it came down to the issue of, if we have to make concessions, if we have to negotiate this,
I did not realize
this territory
that they have got a
what
chat
concessions
going.
are we willing
Let's
to make?
jump into
And
the
what's
chat.
suggested is, if we can't have the term, let us at least have the definition. So the importance of the definition, why the APPG definition in particular, is it that important? And if we can't have it, is there even hope for an alternative? Dr. Shaheen, I'd like to start with you. Your thoughts on the APPG, and can we replace it, or is it irreplaceable for us?
I think it's not the question of replaceable or replace. That's a moot question, actually. That the despite the consensus and despite the long history. So that history includes a lot of mobilization, includes consultation, includes community effort and consensus as well. And despite all of this, and still being put in a position that we have to choose between two concepts we don't like, or we are not much as a community, that process itself becomes Islamophobic in that sense. And if you look at any other forms of anti-discriminatory laws, be it gender discrimination or anti-Black racism discrimination laws, and that no community has been put in this position to choose. So why is it that only the Muslim community is being put in a position to choose? And second is, what do we lose, or what is the loss for the community when we go on with the government's consensus or with what the government wants to do? We lose agency. And that is the beginning of a step towards every time we want a demand, it being diluted. And that very step becomes problematic in future demands for the Muslim community itself. And we become disciplined to give concessions for the greater good. So it's always Muslim opinions, Muslim politics, Muslim voices are always sacrificed at the altar of national security, of development, of giving the right term. So it goes on and on and on. So I think the very idea that we being put in this position itself is problematic, and that should be questioned rather than being made forced to choose.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sabira, your thoughts on the definition and actually on the inquiry itself, being forced to choose, being in this position in the first place.
Yeah, so yeah, as I mentioned before, the APPG definition of Islamophobia is something that we have kind of got behind and encouraged, councils and local authorities to adopt. It is one of the most widely recognised definitions in the UK. So it's been endorsed by, I think, over 800 Muslim organisations, over 100 academics, numerous local authorities and most major political parties as well. One of the key strengths of the APPG definition is that it recognises that Islamophobia goes beyond just hate crimes. So it does quite specifically state it is a form of racism, which helps us to understand that it includes the structural and institutional discrimination that affects Muslims across many areas of life. It acknowledges that, many people face discrimination not just because of their religion, but because of that perceived identity, that perceived Muslim identity, such as their name, clothing, or their skin color. I know there's been a lot of criticism that, the definition itself might stifle freedom of speech or act as a blasphemy law, but the definition itself is quite clear that criticism of religion is protected under British law and it would not be affected by such a definition. What the definition does target is the demonization of Muslims, and it does include that guidance to ensure that, it's not misused in such a way. So it does distinguish between legitimate religious critique and hate that is directed towards individuals because they either are or perceived to be Muslims. So in that sense, it does align with the legal principles and upholds freedom of speech, while also providing that framework to identify and challenge Islamophobia. But one of the things that we have kind of encouraged is that to ensure that the definition is used properly, it should be used alongside the Coalition Against Islamophobia's guidelines. So this protects freedom of expression while explaining how Islamophobia itself manifests in real life. So the guidelines emphasize that, it is a form of racialized religious discrimination. It includes structural, institutional, cultural, and interpersonal forms. And it recognizes how Islamophobia also intersects with other forms of identity, such as gender, race, class, migration status, and things like that. And most importantly, as I mentioned, it does distinguish between freedom of speech and hate speech. So yeah, we as it is, the APPG definition, along with these guidelines, I think can go a long way in addressing all the different forms of Islamophobia, the different forms of discrimination that Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims as well face. I mean, in terms of the alternative, what is the alternative? I mean, it's either Islamophobia, since the Runnymede report that was 30 years ago, we've been trying to push for a definition for a long time. It's like, what, if what are the alternatives? It's either no definition or a weak definition that fails to capture the full scope of the problem.
Thank you very much. Dr. Amina, it's interesting because obviously the APPG definition says that Islamophobia states that Islamophobia is a form of racism. And so that in itself, then you get into the ideas around that. Are Muslims a race? Does that mean they're saying that Muslims are a race? And it really is coming from a very particular perspective because it is applying critical race theory and saying race in that sense. Could you talk about that a bit more, perhaps, and why that would be useful, whatever the end goal is? I mean, if it's like what you said, the end goal is managing the population through death, or by, like Salman Sayyid suggests, limiting Muslimness or defining Muslimness in a very particular way by the state. Yeah.
That's an excellent question, Salsabil. I think in order to make any argument about Islamophobia being a form of racism, we have to get to the heart of that question, or that argument, or the counter argument, which is Islam's not, or Muslims are not a race, and therefore they are not objects of racial injury. That's an excellent question, and I'm not going to answer that first. Okay, I want to answer first the question you posed to Sabira and Shaheen really quickly, because I think it will lend to what I have to say in response to your second question. Okay, so if we take a critical race theory perspective and we respond to your question, Salsabil, about from that perspective, and your first question was anti-Muslim racism, what does it mean to have a definition at this particular moment? And I think we need to be asking this question, right? Why now? Why are we defining Islamophobia in a time when there's a genocide happening? And what does it mean if we take the perspective that British society, that Britain as a nation state is a racial colonial apparatus? Okay, it's rooted in racial hierarchies. It's not a liberal society in the sense that racism is merely just this kind of superficial problem. What happens when you define Islamophobia then is that you are essentially turning it into a technique of power, right? And as Shaheen mentioned, it becomes a way of regulating the political scene, right? It becomes a way of disciplining Muslims as well, and setting the parameters for what counts and doesn't count as Islamophobia. Therefore, what political guarantees and protections will be in place for that, and what will not, right? And so it becomes a way of justifying then, therefore, everything that is left outside of the official definition of Islamophobia. And as Shaheen said, we need to absolutely contest that, because we have a different political project when we try to define Islamophobia. And the state has a political project when it tries to define Islamophobia. We want to make sure that the sort of integrity and the fidelity of our political project isn't sort of influenced, not influenced, but sort of watered down by this official political project. And so our project, in my view at least, is to make sure that we can address Islamophobia in its entirety in a way that's it's expansive. And we want to make sure that we raise the political consciousness of Muslim populations as well as non-Muslim populations about what Islamophobia is. Because as we can see with the history of the term Islamophobia, the Runnymede definition, it was a very rudimentary definition, but it was the definition that was necessary for that moment, right? It was what the political context was able to sort of accept and grapple with. But now we've moved the conversation to Islamophobia as a racism. We don't want to move that conversation backwards. We want to keep moving it forward. We want to keep taking into account the new political developments, and we want to make sure that we are able to create a political project around Islamophobia as a Muslim-led movement that tries to take control of the terms by which we narrate our experiences and narrate what is happening here. Okay, so that was your first question. The second one, I'll be really quick here so that others can feed in. The argument, we've heard it all the time, Islamophobia is not a race, or sorry, Islam is not a race, and therefore, sorry, Muslims are not a race, and therefore Muslims are not capable of racial injury. Well, the assumption underpinning that argument is that races exist in the first place. And critical race theory, and actually science itself, if you want to take a positivist approach, science itself has demonstrated that races don't exist, right? The mapping of the human genome has demonstrated that there's no genetic difference between human races, in the same way there might be genetic differences between a cow and a chicken, right? So science has shown that this notion of race is entirely socially constructed. It was created by people, by a particular colonial project that looked out at the sea of human difference and said, we're going to differentiate this human difference, we're going to categorize it, and we're going to locate it on a hierarchy. And of course, whiteness is at the top and blackness is at the bottom. And then you have relative positions and proximities to whiteness, it's somewhere in between. So if we take this perspective that race is socially constructed, then you can begin to say that Muslimness is also, it can be racialized, right? It can be constructed as a race. You can have Muslimness politically narrated as something inherent, biological, and essential. And when you do that, then Muslimness is racialized, and therefore Muslims can be capable of racial injury. There you go. If you take that perspective, Islamophobia becomes a form of racism. And of course, that's the one I take.
Amazing. No one could have done that. No one else could have done that as well. And as quickly, that was what, 3 minutes? Amazing.
3 minutes? Okay.
On critical race theory, I love it. Okay, so final question to the panel before we move on. Sister Naomi is here from MCB, so we'll have her on just to also give her perspective. But I'll just give ask my final question to you guys. Do we not already have enough? Is there not enough laws and legislation in place to protect all people, all citizens? Is there not enough protection in place? Why do we need a definition? Why do we need to be singled out? Why do we need to be special? Why are we asking for quote unquote special treatment? Shaheen, over to you.
Yeah, so don't existing laws and policies only protect us? That's a question. Yes, we absolutely need a clear and robust definition of Islamophobia, that which we already have. Because existing laws and policies have consistently failed to capture or address the full scope of the problem. It's not just Islamophobia, most forms of racism and discrimination. While the UK has legal protections against discrimination through frameworks like the Equality Act 2010, these laws tend to operate in generic, race-neutral, or religion-neutral terms. They may help in dealing with some forms of overt discrimination or hate crimes, but these laws, they fall short in recognizing the structural and institutional forms of Islamophobia, like how Amina mentioned. Now, without a specific definition, like racism, is often reduced to individual acts of religious intolerance or personal animosity. This obscures how it actually functions as a racialized system of power that targets not only practicing Muslims, but those perceived to be Muslims based on appearance, names, or cultural markers. It also means that a state is not held accountable for policies that actively produce or reinforce Islamophobia. The APPG definition, it gives clarity and consistency. It allows for systematic monitoring. It guides public policy and can also inform educational and media standards. More importantly, it provides recognition. Muslims in the UK continue to face marginalization, surveillance, and exclusion, yet often feel invisible within existing legal frameworks. Legal protection without formal recognition leads to denial and inaction. Ultimately, we need a definition, not because we lack laws, but because we lack the political and institutional will to name Islamophobia for what it is. A formal, meaningful definition is essential. It is a foundation for accountability, justice, and long-term change. Without it, efforts to combat Islamophobia remain piecemeal, reactive, and ultimately ineffective. Naming the problem is the first step towards solving it.
Thank you very much. Now we're over to Dr. Sabira on do we need the protections, but also because she does have to leave soon, she'll talk us through the submission that MEND has made to the inquiry. Just explain a little bit about that, and then we'll come to you, Dr. Anna, if that's okay.
Yeah, so there are existing laws. If you look at we do have the Equality Act, we do have certain laws. However, if we look at the problem of Islamophobia itself, we talk about the rise of Islamophobia all the time, then it just shows, are these laws actually effective? I mean, if you look at the evidence, Home Office data shows that Muslims have been the most targeted religious group in hate crime statistics. So in 2023, 2024, 38% of all religious hate crimes were targeted against Muslims. In October 2024 alone, there was a 763% spike in Islamophobic incidents. And then just last year, we saw the summer 2024 riots, the far-right riots, targeting Muslim communities. Mosques were vandalized, Muslim-owned businesses were damaged, and individuals were insulted. And since then, we've seen, further attacks on Muslims and places of worship. And we've seen that political rhetoric has only fueled this hostility. So public figures from parties like Reform UK, who have openly kind of used inflammatory language against Muslims, but not only that, the previous Conservative government, and the kind of pushing of anti-Muslim or, Islamophobic conspiracy theories to kind of, push a very, negative view of Muslims. So, I mean, all of these things have contributed to a climate of hostility towards Muslims, which existing laws have not proved to be as effective, or I mean, like the Equality Act does offer some protection, but it doesn't go far enough in tackling the growing problem of Islamophobia. And so without a clear definition, Islamophobia it's misunderstood, ignored, or dismissed, making it harder for people to report and for public bodies to recognize it and to respond effectively.
Amazing, thank you.
Sorry, you're on mute, Sasvia.
Oh, sorry. Do you wanna run us through the MEND submission right now, or do you wanna wait until we finish this?
What if I could run through the submission quickly, yeah.
Sure.
1 moment, I'll just get it up.
Sorry, it's down. We'll come to you in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So hang on 1 moment, let me just get it up first of all quickly. So I mean the yeah, 1 moment. So yeah, so the government's call for evidence. So MEND submitted a submission for call for evidence on our views on Islamophobia and what the government should include in the formal definition. So this covered 5 main areas. This included the terminology that should be used, the need for a definition. So a lot of the things that we've been discussing today, what terminology should be used, is there a need for a definition, whether racism should be a component of any new definition, and what should be included in that definition, as well as examples of anti-Muslim hatred / Islamophobia, as they say. So although the questions cover quite broad and important topics, the actual the form itself, so the responses are actually very limited in terms of it's got a very small character limit. So we've had to focus on very key points and clear reasoning when formulating our response. So I mean, I think for the first couple of questions, it's only like 600 characters to explain why we think Islamophobia should be used as opposed to anti-Muslim hatred. And you can imagine, that's like 100 words or something. And how much we've discussed today, the kind of how it's almost impossible to kind of include all of that in a submission. So it has had to be quite focused to show how we think Islamophobia is the better term to be used. And of course, it does come down to what we mentioned about being a more comprehensive term, covering the broader kind of structural and institutional kind of forms of discrimination that cannot be captured under something, that just covers hate, because those are kind of, unconscious biases that might not be as, obvious, in places like employment or schools and things like that. So yeah, it has been quite a challenge to keep them to keep our responses quite focused and to to the point. So yeah, I mean, again, on the need for a definition as well, it has it's similar kind of things that we've discussed today. Why do we need a definition? Highlighting the rise in Islamophobia. Statistics show over the last few years, there's been a steady increase over decades, but it's especially, I would say, within the last couple of years, we have seen a significant increase, especially since October 2023. We've seen like the far right riots last year, the kinds of political rhetoric that has become so kind of overtly Islamophobic. It's so all of these things you demonstrate the need that there is a need for a definition in order to effectively tackle it on all levels, not just on the kind of everyday acts of hate and violence. And then of course, whether Islamophobia is a form of racism as well, it's something that as Dr. Amna as well, quite eloquently put it, it does kind of, it is broader than just saying, oh, Muslims can't be considered a race. The kind of something that's understanding Islamophobia or understanding Muslims as something that discrimination is socially constructed, based on all of these various factors that we've just mentioned, whether it's political rhetoric, media portrayals, certain biases, and things that have been around for a long time. So yeah, I mean, the submission itself, as I mentioned, I'm talking about all of these things, and I'm also telling you how limited the form actually is. So it has had to be, I mean, all of those points are things that we have included, but they've had to be kind of condensed down into very to the point statements, as Islamophobia, we do, yes, we do advocate for, we do want Islamophobia to be used over anti-Muslim hatred because of how widely recognized it is, and how it captures the broader scope of the problem. So these are all things that we have kind of included, as well as as I mentioned about how it is also a form of racism, but like I said, it is very limited in the kinds of in terms of how much information we are able to include in there. So it is kind of very, but at the same time, it is a very straightforward form with a handful of questions. So it's just a matter of being very brief but descriptive enough to show why this matters, what the extent of the problem is, and how you can feed into this is an opportunity to shape how Islamophobia is understood and tackled in the UK. So yeah, I think the deadline to submit is Sunday the 20th of July, so it's this weekend, so there's only a few days left. But as I mentioned, it is a very straightforward form with a handful of questions with a very small character limit, but it's just, as I said, just responses should be very kind of focused on the key points, given that the character limit is very limited.
Thank you very much. And also, I think the inquiry is still open, right, until the 20th of July for anyone to submit their own. So I would encourage everyone on this call to do so. And if you have any questions or queries about it, then ask them here in the chat. I can see there's some great questions in the chat already. So keep asking, and we'll get to them very soon, inshallah. Dr. Amina Sharif, we'll come back to you quickly on why we need protections, why the current legal framework isn't enough, before we move on to all the many questions that we have.
Yeah, I think Shaheen really summarized that need very well. I think we do need accountability. And it's a funny question, actually, because our immediate thought is that, yes, we need to have laws and we need to have legal protection.
Let's try again. I've been kicked out. I'm gonna see if I can get back in. Should do us fine. Alright, let's see. Okay.
Not something specific to the UK. We must see that Islamophobia is global. So repressive laws that you see here, you can see the same laws in other parts of the world, in other
Vietnam,
parts
it
of
is.
Europe, in Asia, in India, in the US. So state violence, media demonization, the normalization of anti-Muslim discourse. So what we see is an exponential increase in this at the global level. So even our response must go beyond generic calls for pragmatism or tolerance or relying solely on legal protections. What is needed is actually a coordinated, multi-layered, and importantly, unapologetic political response recognizes Islamophobia as a global system of racialized control
Yes.
and exclusion. And more than that, what we can also is important is that it also, by naming it as racism, it also integrates our demands or our struggle along with the struggles for anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, any other forms of discrimination, rather than just seeing a Muslim demand as a separate category of grievance. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Amina, any thoughts on how we can be pragmatic about this, or maybe play the hand we're dealt as best as we can, come out with the best possible outcome, if that's the thing at all?
I don't have anything to add. I think Shaheen really said it very well. And I agree with him 100%.
Shaheen is a victimhood.
Naomi, over to you. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, not much to add to that as well. I think
Shaheen is a professional victimhood card player.
Really well.
Amazing. Okay, so we've got a question from Mossab. So he's saying that in current times, terms, labels often no longer rooted in their definitions, so the technical definition might not matter as much as the impact that it has. So they further an agenda and are often weaponized. So terms like anti-Semitism or even fascism, Islamism, communism, it's just a stampede of labels, and they're just often used just to silence people or silence discourse and narratives. So the question is, how are Muslim organizations and individuals, how will they be able to understand the definition which will allow them to utilize and weaponize? I'm not sure what this means. I'm not sure if it's about creating power, using a definition, or have a definition that we can then use to our advantage. I acknowledge weaponize is too strong, but in our current state, we haven't been able to wield and utilize Islamophobic definitions. Okay, so I think that's kind of maybe in my mind also why a lot of these questions arise, because there might be an idea that we failed to make Islamophobia mean anything. We've had the term for a long time. Shaheen, as you explained the genealogy, it goes back for a very long time, but politically, practically, Said Owasi said years and years ago that it still passes the DNA table test. It does. We saw in the US with Zoran Ramdani's election, and like the wave of Islamophobia that was it was normal. It's regular discourse, and so that failure to make it mean anything could be why certain members of the community and even others are just looking outwards. We've been ignored so much that we've just started to think that what we've been doing simply doesn't work. So I think the core of this question is, how do we make it work? How do we make it matter politically? Shaheen, over to you.
Yeah, so again, there are two dimensions to this question, or to address that particular question. One is of course, for any concept, any term, especially in terms of anti-discrimination or anti-racism, for it needs to have the power that it needs to. It needs to have political will as well. And if that is not something that we easily get, and history has taught us in a very painful manner that communities do not get what they want by appealing to the good heart of its oppressor. So even when Amina talked about the African American experience, or whatever little they got during the civil rights movement, if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, the institution or the American government at
If
the
I
time,
put this question up, I think I'm going to get kicked off again. So I think I'm going to hold off to this. I'm going to hold off with this question.
Hence the reason
so
why they conceded
wait.
to some, or partly to some of the demands. And we have seen its impact as well. Although, as I would agree with what Amina said, they didn't get exactly what they wanted, but we see its impact to address a question. For example, any politician in the West being accused of racism, anti-Black racism, would not last. That is the last. They would lose their jobs, they would lose their political constituency, all these things. And this is exactly what we must try to bring and bear on Islamophobia as well. Although it doesn't still have the potency of anti-Black racism, still certain figures in the public sphere would be loath to call Islamophobic. To an extent, that danger is there of being termed Islamophobic. Not for everybody, maybe people the far right wouldn't mind it, but at least people in the center left and liberals would mind it. So there is that currency and not only just in the English-speaking world. In places like India, for example, Islamophobia has become a term in currency. There are studies inside India, inside China, Islamophobia in India, Islamophobia in Russia, for example. So you find it even transcending language barriers as well as a terminology. So it has some sort of potency and power. And that is because of this international solidarity and international Muslim mobilization. But of course, it has still a long way to go. And that is part of the political will of the communities to push it through.
Thank you very much. Dr. Amina, do you have anything you'd like to add to that idea? You're still muted, sorry.
Right, so I was saying that, I think it was so well answered that I don't think I need to come in, and I'm happy to move on to the next question.
Okay. Naomi, is there anything you'd like to come in? Any comments you'd like to come in for that?
Sorry, I have visitors too.
Okay, no worries.
That's fine. Just around how we haven't used it. So I had to pop out there. I think, look, the fact that Islamophobia hasn't taken hold isn't because, well, two things. I think we have to be more united as a community across different groups, across different communities. As Muslims, we have to be more united in terms of getting a political will to change things. But there's been a lot of pressure against the definition and against the term, for not just in the past year,